We will commence. Thank you, everybody, for attending this today. We're going to be discussing black duck foods or Indigenous food that is being developed. And before we go any further, Farmers for Climate Action would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we work and the traditional owners of the land our guests and speakers are joining us from. I'm joining from the lands of the Wiradjuri people in southern New South Wales, and we pay respects to the elders past and present and extend that respect to any First Nations people that are with us today. Now, we're in the meeting room type style of Zoom today, which means that we can interact with you a bit more directly as we have question and answers, but it also means that it can become a bit disruptive if people don't turn their microphones off. So please turn off all your microphones and we'll work the rest of it from here. We can't see everybody in the meeting, obviously. We'll be able to see those that are talking. Now, first up today, we have Jacob Birch. Jacob is a Gamilaroi Maori First Nations man through matrilineal descent. For those of you who are unaware, Gamilaroi land is in northern New South Wales, sort of centred around Moree, I guess, up to the McIntyre River. I'm happy to be corrected on that because I don't really know, but that's roughly where I believe it to be. The Gamilaroi are grass people who have intangible cultural links to grasses and the grain they produce. And Jacob has conducted multidisciplinary research, which includes research into the nutritional qualities of traditional grain for human health and Indigenous research methodologies which give agency to First Nations voices and experience. Jacob now finds himself working for Black Duck Foods and hopefully developing and promoting those foods. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Jacob to tell us all about Indigenous food development.
Thanks, Peter. Am I coming through all right?
Yep, you're working well.
Oh, yama, everyone. Yeah, that Gamilaroi lands go from like Tamworth all the way up to St. George, Queensland, so it's fairly large country. My ancestry is up towards the north of that country, so up around Mungandai and that. I'll just do a quick acknowledgement as well, and I always try to do this in Gamilaroi, because one thing we talk about is like bringing back this vibrant cultural diversity across the landscape, and part of that is the language. So I'll just quickly do that. Gabi gabi dango iringo ngaya ungali ango walabaga galu. Winingala na maya marang gunima wayamago ningaingu winingay ngaya uni ngaya ngarli ngananda winingay nginda uni. So let's acknowledge the Kabi people, whose country I'm on. I pay my respects to you, all you people on here today, and I just acknowledge the respect that you're showing me. Just acknowledge everybody who's put this together today. Thank you, and putting trust in us to present a fairly good thing. Try not to be too cheeky about it. So yeah, my name is Jacob Birch. I do a couple of different things. I do a little bit of work for Southern Cross University in the Regen Ag degree. I think a few students are here today. How you going, students? I also work for Black Duck Foods on a traditional grains roadmap. So it's pretty much the work that I'm going to talk about today. Go to the next slide, please. I just that first slide there was just the thing that I did for APEC a little while back, the first people, first economy. You're not allowed to say nation or country because it offends one of the big countries in APEC. So you say economies, but I thought that was really cool because it's acknowledging that Australia's first peoples ran the first economies. So when you think about Australia's first peoples, you probably think, not all of you, but like this narrative that we were fed when I was growing up is like Australia's first peoples were wandering nomads, living opportunistically on the edge of existence. And that narrative is changing, but there's also well-resourced groups out there continuing to push that narrative. And that is a false narrative, obviously, for whatever reason, protect national identity, whatever. But it's counterproductive anyway to what we're trying to do. So like I said, we were the first economies. We're the oldest culture in the world. We have a genetic heritage here that goes back 60,000 years. So that's an unbroken genetic lineage. We have stories that remember ice ages. We have stories that remember when the sea level was 100 years below and then 80 meters high than it is today. And we led the first economies. So Australia's first international export came out of Arnhem Land and the coastal waters Kimberley. And that was actually Trepang, and that was traded with the Makassar people of the Indonesian archipelago. And that trade may have started 900 years ago, and it was probably in full production for about 300 years up until the early 1900s when the government taxed it out of existence. But my focus is really on this transcontinent grain economy that sustained like the majority of inland Australia before colonisation. So probably 30% of the diet came from grains, and at times more during ceremony, that sort of thing. So this first map on the far left was a map produced by Tyndale, and it's also sort of been updated by Cheevers and et al. Others. So Norman Tyndale was a famous Australian anthropologist, he was an archaeologist and an ethnologist, and he's penned this Tyndale Arc that we see here in that first map. So it's an arc representing the regions that Tyndale hypothesized as being a pre-colonisation grain belt, and that's based on evidence that he collected over decades of spent in the field doing like direct field work, research and engagement with knowledge holders. So my ancestors' lands are represented in there, the Ualaroi and Kamilaroi. That's big grass economies in there. And you can see the blue diamonds, and I don't know how big you can see this, but there's little cross hatches in there as well. They're sites of grindstones. You can see they're spread all over the country. And that's fairly consistent grinding across the geological timeline. Some of those grindstones go back 60,000 years. And that's part of the evidence where we say we've been here 60,000 years is because these grindstones go back that far. So you can also see Tyndale underestimated the importance of grass, particularly up there in the north. So there's even more evidence coming out recently just southwest of the Kungari. There's a little crosshatch there, a Mythica people's country. They're far southwest of Queensland, near Windora. There's scientific evidence coming out of there, like showing massive cultural landscapes, evidence of sedentary occupation, water management, extensive grain-based economies, and it includes one of the largest grindstone quarries on Earth, and that could be over 40,000 years old. And like I don't doubt that quarry would have been the centre of like a cross-continent trade between all different language groups. So there's evidence there of rainforest soils out in the Channel Country. So very interesting stuff. Evidence of really dramatic changes in the pollen coring from when cattle arrived there. So that's part of the reason why we just don't know much about it, because cattle and sheep have been so detrimental to these original economies, dramatically changing the landscape. So this is a massive site hidden there in plain sight, but it's so large you can't appreciate it without being in the air from helicopter or plane. Despite the size, that's an economy that has completely fallen out of use and functionality because of the impacts of colonization and like these Northern Hemisphere farming practices. So my passion is re-establishing this ancient grain belt. So in the map, in the middle map, you see the existing conventional cropping belt in Australia. And that's probably contracting a bit due to land degradation. So we have things like climate change making it harder to grow a crop, you know, longer drought, more intense drought, rain coming in. So there's a really, really excellent crop out west of where I am this year. I haven't seen it like that in my whole life. Farmers I've spoken to out there, this is the once in 40-year event, and then they were ready to take the grain off, best crop they've had, and the rains came, and I've just, you know, get rain on a crop that's ready to harvest, it's trouble. So that conventional grain belt is probably contracting due to all those issues like salinity, acidity, erosion, water issues. So you can see that they don't overlap very much. And then on the far right is like my favorite little species, genus there, the Estrella genus. There's 4 little grasses, humble little things that I think will change the whole narrative in Australia. And you can see they're growing in semi-arid places. So go to the next slide, please. So we've got this like grand ambition and idea of re-establishing this like huge traditional grain arc, but like, where do you start? We've lost so much knowledge, and like we're a small team trying to answer all these questions. We don't have all the answers. So we're talking about this 60,000-year-old story, but like really we're just at the beginning again. So a big part of what I do, what Black Duck does, is like educating people. So like we do higher level stuff, like, you know, talking to people like GRDC, for example, just spoke to, like this sort of thing. And then on the other end is the grassroots sort of stuff. So we need to talk to the high level stakeholders, people who can invest and provide all that expertise, but we also need to speak to the people on the ground at the grassroots. So, and that's what I like doing. So that the image on the right there is a little workshop that I held right in the center of Brisbane. It was exclusively for other First Nations people, and that was just to share. I shared grain, we cooked damper together, we shared stories. You know, like it's telling people like this is what our ancestors used to do. Like this is the opportunity that we have. Like I shared all my knowledge on nutrition. I tell people about the opportunities that I see this stuff could bring. But I'm also like trying to learn from people, you know, like for sort of demographic that hasn't really been listened to when it comes to developing their bush foods. I'm really trying to understand how we can change that. Yeah, so like all this sharing and learning that we do, we're learning about all different things like nutrition, which species we used, what people did which things, how to grow it, how to harvest, how to thresh it, how to cook with it, how to get it through food safety laws, how to protect cultural and intellectual knowledge, like all those things. And we're trying to represent the interests of First Nations people too. Try and get this industry done in our way, led by us pretty much. And hopefully our R&D roadmap will sort of give a fairly clear and concise vision of how to do that. So next slide, please. Yeah, so what we're aiming to achieve is like this, in this emerging, you know, traditional grain industry, is an industry that is governed and owned by Australia's first people, but it's fully inclusive as well, you know, like it brings everyone together, hopefully. But we want to make this led and owned by First Nations people, because like we have this thriving bush food industry, but you know, and we have some real success stories like macadamia. But whilst all this knowledge has come from First Peoples within this thriving industry, only like 1 to 3% of the benefits go back to First Nations people. And that's probably a huge overestimation too, because it probably doesn't take into account things like tea tree, that's used for antimicrobial properties. Like, doesn't take into account macadamia, that's like a hugely lucrative crop, and it definitely doesn't take into account all the seafood. Like, you think about seafood, the first fishermen post-colonization, the first fisher people, actually, because a lot of women fish too, were First Nations people, and they were displaced from those economies as well. So yeah, and it also, we also don't really acknowledge, I feel, the vital role that First Nations people played in the early agricultural industry, either through slavery or as refugees. A lot of the early successes of the agriculture industry in Australia was because of First Nations people. So we don't want this to become like every other bush food industry in Australia. But what's that going to look like? Well, we have different values, and we aim for this industry that achieves these a multitude of benefits. So it's not just that economic bottom line. It's that doing business in an Indigenous way. So it's about like a holistic vision. Nothing's more or less important than the other things. So I'm talking about things like social impact, environmental impact, economic impact, and the cultural outcome. You could say, and this is what Chris says, the cultural is the overarching thing. So nothing else can exist without having that cultural overarching benefit over all of those other three things, like the social, environmental, and economic. So we don't want to just be focused on the economic, because we're at a stage now where that's not working for us on planet Earth. And like I guess there's a growing movement of impact investment and, you know, corporations getting involved in like social and environmental impact investing, but a lot of it's probably genuine, but there's a lot of businesses, I think, also realizing they can do a fair bit with a little bit of social license. But like for us, we fundamentally believe in all of these outcomes like social, environmental, economic, and cultural benefits. And the majority of businesses in Australia run by First Peoples are actually social enterprises. And like for every dollar earned by a First Nations person, more than $4 is returned back in social impact. So there's benefit and reason to doing that. Just that image there, that's a little traditional grain crop ready for harvest. And this is a site where you couldn't grow like a conventional crop on. You'd have like way too much erosion, the weather would be too variable. But here we have on this site a perennial grass that is holding soil together. It's a pretty good grazing crop too, if you want to chuck some cattle on it afterwards. We're not saying you can't graze cattle. I think in a lot of cases you'll have that stacked enterprise model. So jump to the next slide, please. So I'm just going to start talking about some of the benefits that we see. And this nutritional quality is the work that I did for my honours research, and these are some graphs and images from my thesis. So I haven't included species names for the traditional grains because it's actually from a paper that's in preparation. So yeah, I looked at doing the sort of basic nutritional analyses on 7 different native species, and I compared all of those to brown rice, Australian grown brown rice, because we think of brown rice as being, you know, the healthy alternative when it comes to cereals. And like crazy, none of this research has really been done before. on a lot of the species. Mine's the first that I know of for several species looking at these sort of properties. And a part of it was like, if we can find some really beneficial nutrition in this, then that's a selling point for this industry. You know, like things like hemp and quinoa are crazy. And I don't know if you've had hemp and quinoa, but it's not that nice. Like, it doesn't taste that good, I don't reckon. But it's still a product that's viable out there, and it's got small grains and that sort of thing, same as their native. So yeah, it was trying to find something really interesting to promote it on. And yeah, definitely did find that. So in general, very low carbohydrates. So that first graph is the protein. Brown rice is the one on the far left, down the bottom, about 8% protein, which is expected. But then all our natives just keep going up and up. And you can see one of them there goes over 37% protein, which is, according to Australia's nutritional reference values, that's higher than chicken breast. So the high protein corresponded generally with low carbohydrates. So the higher the protein, the lower the carbs, which is important because we have this diet that's overloaded with carbohydrates these days. And then I also found the phenolics were really interesting and high. So phenolics are like an antioxidant. They sell things like blueberries based on these high levels. Black rice and paddy rice are both products that demand a premium because they have high antioxidant, high phenolic content. And some of these natives have equal or more than this black rice and paddy rice. So one of them's got over 600, one population within a species had over 600 milligrams of gallic acid equivalent. And then also of the fats, they were dominated by polyunsaturated fats, really high mineral profiles. So things like iron, zinc, calcium in particular was really, really high. One of the species had more calcium than full cream's cow milk per serving, and better ratios with magnesium and phosphorus, which makes the absorption of calcium better as well. And these are all really important, just like in general, because even in developed countries like Australia, where we're deficient in minerals like this, particularly iron and zinc, just because our food's lacking it. So even though this stuff's growing on like marginal land, it's still managing to pull out so much more nutrients and minerals out of the soil than a conventional crop could. And that's without fertilizer or irrigation. So in general, I found like the nutritional properties would be really, really good for bone and joint health. And that's important for First Nations people too, because like rheumatoid arthritis is really prevalent, along with things like diabetes. And obviously this stuff high in phenolics, low in carbs is going to be good for diabetes. We're not sure yet if they're gluten-free. We've been offered that chance to put them into like a gluten-free study, but we want to make sure we manage any conflicts of interest. So there's also, it's a delicate place to navigate, because it's not too much of a stretch to go from looking at one type of nutrition to going into looking into like a biomedical or biotechnical applications, like things like proteins and peptides are really lucrative these days. And startup companies can become multi-billion-dollar companies overnight by mapping out proteins and peptides, because technology is advanced. We can do that now, and these proteins and peptides are really, really valuable for drug companies and that sort of thing. So yeah, if people are going to be using our traditional grains for that kind of research, like we want to sort of be at the table to talk about that and see if there can be some sort of benefit sharing agreement, because this is like a 60,000-year-old food story. Like I think we should be at that table, and some of that money would be really helpful for us because we operate on a shoestring here. But anyway, I'm getting off topic a little bit, but that's sort of an important thing to be aware of working in like the First Nations food space. Historically, we're dispossessed of knowledge time and time again, like, you know, biotech, biomedical, pharmaceutical companies love going after biocultural knowledge because the chance of finding something like an active compound, or, you know, it's really, really high when you go for that Indigenous cultural intellectual property compared to blind testing. So you always got to be aware of any potential exploitation. And that's what people say, is like, just hold space for us. Like, next slide, please. So one of the reasons that, like, the main reason I think for me is why I think this is such a innovative and exciting opportunity is because, like, these native traditional grasses are long-lived perennial grasses. So this is a paddock here. It's had the Strebler apicea cultivated into it. The Strebler species grow for four decades. We don't really know how long they grow for. It could be as old as a tree. We just haven't looked at them. We don't know. I know they grow for 40 years because like a senior scientist with Department of Fisheries and Agriculture has been looking at the same plants for that long. So it's a long-lived perennial. Once it's in the ground, it's in there for the lifetime of that farmer, and it's going to self-seed itself. So what I'm saying is, like, you can harvest the yield of grain off these grasses without ever having to replant the field. So it's like those 1,000-year-old olive groves in Sardinia. Like, once they're established, generations can continue to harvest off them. So this image here is a paddock in semi-arid region of southwest Queensland. So 4 years and 40, you'll get good conditions for cropping. You don't say 1 in 10 because sometimes drought goes for longer than 10 years. So this is 200 hectares of what was under wheat cultivation, but, you know, one year in 10 you'll get maybe a really good crop. It's getting harder and harder for this farmer to grow wheat on there. And for 20 years he was trying to find something else to grow. 20 years the agronomist, no offense to agronomist, but 20 years he was told to grow non-native pasture grasses. Took him 20 years to try a native perennial that wanted to be there. So yeah, this is why I love these little grasses. If in drought, like if that was under wheat production, you'd have bare ground, you'd be getting like massive temperature spikes, big dust storms where topsoil blows over to Brisbane or New Zealand. There's no habitat, there's no structure in the soil. So when you get rain, it just runs off, it doesn't infiltrate. But now the soil is covered at all times. So you're creating this microclimate at the ground layer that's preventing those big temperature spikes. You've got the perennial grasses putting carbon back into the soil, providing habitat for biodiversity, which would be helping with pest outbreaks. When you get rain, it infiltrates the soil. Because it's tussock forming, between the tussocks, you get all the herbaceous layer in there, a lot of nitrogen fixing the forbs and that sort of thing. So the natives, they're fully adapted to local soil and climate. So they don't require fertilizer, don't require pesticide, don't need irrigation. And all of these things are sort of becoming a bigger cost for farmers. And we need to start thinking about fertilizer too, because we're going to run out of phosphorus eventually. So you're getting all these environmental benefits, you're saving costs on external inputs. You can graze this paddock, so the farmer grazes sheep on here. So you're getting that stacked enterprise. So getting yield of grain, you're grazing sheep or cattle. You can tap into biodiversity, carbon market, agri-tourism opportunities. And there's also those mental health benefits of the farmer too. Like imagine for 20 years trying to cultivate this paddock and having it fail year after year. Now it's a beautiful site, and it's a beautiful thing for that farmer. to see flocks of sheep moving through that country. And we'd also like to see this benefit the rural and remote communities too. So little processing hubs set up in remote communities that I see as being something that's going to be a real like agri-tourism opportunity, little tourist draw card, get in all those Winnebagos. Yeah, so someone just asked, I saw one little thing come up earlier, how do you harvest that? That was harvest with a combine. Took a little bit of fiddling around, but they figured out how to harvest that with a combine harvester. So can you jump onto the next slide, please? So everything I've been talking about, we come back around to like, how do we sell that nutrition story to the customer? How do we sell the cultural story? How do we protect intellectual and cultural IP? So we're proposing to use things like blockchain to authenticate that. So I'm not like full savvy with this sort of stuff. I'm jack of all trade, master of none. And pretty much blockchain is like a digital record that cannot be tampered with. So from paddock to plate, each step of the journey can be verified and recorded, so that when the consumer sees this product sitting on the shelf, they can scan like a QR code and everything pops up about everything about that product can pop up on your phone. So where's it from? Who are the traditional custodians of this product? What's the language and cultural story? What's the nutrition? Has this product contributed to carbon storage? Is this supporting biodiversity? Who processed the product? How many jobs does it support? And all these things can help the consumer make an informed choice. And like, consumers will make the right choice because we're all consumers. We're not dumb. Like, we'll choose the product that is ethical, and we'll choose the product that is contributing to the continuance of the world's oldest living culture. But in saying all that, like, we still don't have a paddock to plate industry. Like, we've got a lot of hurdles to overcome yet. Like I said, it's just me and Chris working in this space, two people. We don't have all the answers. It's things like threshing. But when there's issues that need to be overcome, that's a chance for innovation. That's a chance for a new industry. So this threshing the grain, like when you harvest wheat off a paddock, the combine will thresh it and everything. It'll thresh it, winnow it. You're just left with the wheat. That doesn't happen with this. So we need to have that extra step in there of threshing it. But that's another opportunity for development. Yeah, so there's also with that threshing opportunity, I see the milling opportunity going hand in hand in community. So I was saying the rural and regional development, you thresh it and you mill it on country, and you set that up in a little country town. And ideally you would see that under like women's governance, because this is a big women's story as well. So I guess we need a lot of research and development. Traditional foods are considered novel foods, so they have to pass through food safety laws, despite being used for 60,000 years. And when we scale up, we need to scale up capacity of First Peoples. So it's either through like land ownership, entrepreneurial skills training, professional training. Like, for example, you get about 800 graduates in Australia coming out of agricultural degrees. Of that 800 strong cohort, the average number of First Nations people within that cohort is 5. Some years it's 0. So some years there's 0 First Nations people graduating with an agricultural degree. So that's a massive gap there. There's also a lot of research happening around commercializing these grains. So I guess that's another sort of important thing to sort of take into account, is like, who's that going to benefit? What I see is going to happen is like, you'll get a commercial variety. It'll be grown using the exact same methods as any other conventional crop. It'll be grown conventionally. It'll lose that cultural story. It could lose the nutritional story. and it won't have all those benefits going to all the social and environmental impacts. And I said before, like, that's important, because we need to start doing business a little bit differently if we want to, you know, make this a better world for our kids and grandkids. So I think we can go on to the last slide. So I just finish off usually with a little bit of a yarn, and related to this picture. So this is a mountaintop in northern New South Wales, right in the middle of what was before colonisation the largest subtropical rainforest in Australia. They call it the Big Scrub. There's only about 1% of that rainforest remains. There's a remnant of the Gondwanan rainforest that once covered Australia, South America, and New Zealand. But the thing is, this grassy spot has always been there. So it's always been an open grassland, despite being situated right in the middle of the largest subtropical rainforest in Australia, although it's surrounded by macadamia farms now. So the Widjaba Waible people, they actually kept it that way. They kept these open networks of grassland that intersected that rainforest like highways. My ancestors were west of this spot, directly west of here, up over the mountains, over the Great Dividing Range, and my intuition tells me that they would have travelled up and down this like a highway, coming down to the coast for ceremony and vice versa, which is what happened. People travelled and did trade and ceremony and conducted business. But this is also a really strategic site. You can see 80 kilometres from this site into Queensland. It's a sacred site because all of the features in that landscape, they tell a story. And you can also tell a sacred site in Australia, because that's usually where the churches are built. And there's a church right across from this. So what I'm saying with this story is there's an intangible cultural importance there. So we have a real opportunity here to like revitalize this vibrant, diverse cultural ecosystem across the continent. And I also like it because there's a sunset and a moonrise. I see the sunset as like, this is the end of our era of, you know, taking the earth for granted. We're at this precipice now where the moon's rising, and we need to make a choice what the next day is going to look like. Yeah, so how do we solve these issues? Is it business or usual, or do we shift the paradigm? So I just finished by saying Mari Yanaya, Walamba Yanaya Ngarage. So it's go well and go strong into the future. Just a little thing there to join our consultation. I'll finish there. Thank you.
Thanks, Jacob. That was really quite educational and interesting. We've got a few questions, but we'll leave them till the end. I'd just like to introduce Chris Andrew at the moment, at this right now. Chris is the General Manager of Black Duck Foods Limited, an Indigenous social enterprise committed to traditional food systems that care for country and return economic benefits directly to Indigenous peoples. An early career in the global investment banking and oil sectors, I don't know how that'll tie in, but anyway, underpin the focus on managing people and enterprises dedicated to accelerating community development outcomes. Chris holds a degree in chemical engineering and teaching. So without further ado, we'll hand over to Chris and he can explain the oil industry to us.
Warami and Ghani from Duro Country in Sydney. I won't go back and try and explain or apologise for what I was doing prior to coming to this, but I am trying to make up for maybe doing a few things that on reflection probably didn't do great things for the planet and maybe contributed to where we're at. So part of this journey is a little bit of rediscovery of the soul. So I won't go into great detail beyond the amazing work and words that Jacob shared with us all. And I think it's important as part of this session to have a young Indigenous man sort of lead this conversation in terms of sharing that knowledge and really share what is an opportunity for all Australians. And so we have a wonderful opportunity where it is a 65,000-year-old story to celebrate around foods, and part of that story is coming to the fore, and we are learning more. And I see a lot of the questions that come through, and there's a thirst for knowledge I think one of the things we need to understand is that a lot of that knowledge in the past has been stolen. And so this thirst for knowledge has to be tempered with how do we make sure that we thrive on what First Nations knowledge is in terms of how do we ensure that it's respectful and equitable in a lot of ways that we move forward. What I want to do is paint a picture that says, actually, here's a native grain story. How do we move it forward? And part of the work that Jacob and I are involved in Black Duck Foods, and we have some wonderful supporters at Atticus now that are helping us along that journey, is that we are working on an industry roadmap for the native grain sector, which will plan what the next 5 years of research, development and extension work means in terms of taking this 65,000-year-old story into a contemporary sort of industry sector. And there's a lot of questions that need to be answered. There's a lot of bridges that need to be built. There's a lot of showcases on how to adopt this, and there's a lot of barriers that we need to overcome. But can we look somewhere to try and glean that story? So if I could go to the next slide. And Jacob's already touched on the Tyndale Arc. And the beauty about this is a picture that's been around since the 70s in a lot of ways. You know, this is knowledge that an anthropologist put out there. So in some ways, this story was there. We just weren't looking properly. And more importantly, this story's been there for a long, long time with First Nations people, and we just never heard it because we never thought that there'd be a system here supporting them across the nation. And on reflection, how does a community survive for 65,000 years without a complex, sustainable food system supporting them? So if we could go to the next slide. So if we've already sort of summarised the value of this Indigenous native grain system, deep-rooted native perennials. They sequester soil carbon. They can stimulate regional economies. We'll showcase a little bit how. They can boost biodiversity. And importantly, in a lot of areas, build resilience back into our national landscape. And that's just not into the soils, that's into our communities. So we have a significant opportunity to reinvigorate the way that we think and do business around our food systems. If we could go to the next slide. So maybe this is the segue into a past life into the oil industry. So one of the things is, how do we get there? What's our retail marketing plan for native grains? And if we just sort of take a bit of a stop and think, well, back 20 years ago, we were looking at, you know, how do we decarbonise the transport sector? And E10 was born. This is putting 10% of ethanol into our fuel sector. And many proponents also argued the case that as we build that sector, that ethanol sector, we're also building broader socioeconomic and environmental benefits as well. The federal government got behind the plan and stimulated it. And when they shut it down in 2015, they basically pumped almost $1 billion to generate, accelerate, and develop the ethanol sector. So the next slide. So what does that mean for a native grain sector? What if we took the E10 idea and said, what if we had F5? That 5% of all the flour in Australia contained native grain. That we set up and established a flour standard where we can channel investment into reinvigorating this native grain sector. We can make it consumer-led, that pulls us along. And in that way, we normalise traditional food systems that have existed for thousands of years. We get access to that food story, and we bring these native grains into the dinner table. And we don't do it as a marginalised superfood language. We do it through, it's on the shelf at our favourite stores, and we go and collect it. We start normalising 60,000 years of food history. It's not impossible. We've done it before. We've done it in the oil industry. Why can't we do it in the food industry? And people are out there trying to look for roadmaps on putting carbon back into soil. Here's a fairly straightforward one, and we know that it's existed, and we know what it can be doing in terms of the benefits it could be delivering to a broader landscape. So if we go to the next slide. what we're looking at in a lot of ways is what does culinary reconciliation look like? How do we drive truth in food? How do we understand our history through what we're going to eat? How do we all come together and share this amazing asset we've got, which is a 65,000-year-old, continuously living, oldest culture in the world? So here's an opportunity for Australia. Here's a roadmap that could be drawn out that sets us on a path where we start establishing this notion of bringing along these native grains back into our food vernacular. And it's also an opportunity where we can celebrate a culture and bring that together for us. If we just flick to the last slide. So we are preparing an industry research, development and extension roadmap for Indigenous native grains to deliver to AgriFutures. We are keen to invite different groups and stakeholders to join a consultation process. And what we would be doing is, as Jacob's already listed, if you'd like to join that, feel free to reach out to the team at Farmers for Climate Action, or feel free to contact Black Duck Foods directly at info@blackduckfoods.org. So it's not hard in a lot of ways. It's just about trying to reimagine what food systems should be doing. And it's about reimagining how we humanize our food story rather than dehumanize it. So thanks everybody for joining this Zoom. And I think we're going to flick back to Peter to try and summarize some of the questions and give Jacob and I a bit of a crack at it.
We will most certainly do that. Just before we do that, you might answer the first question, because there's almost unlimited number of questions coming through. Where will people go to get information? Can they go to Black Duck website and get more information, or should they approach you directly?
Depending on the notion of information, there's a wealth out there. So if they're looking for, perennials in their local area, the CMA's, local land service network have got this information out there as a first port of call. I think we also encourage a lot of people to actually make contact with First Nations people that are on the lands that they're occupying, because that's where the conversation is really got to start. That's where it's going to be driven, and that's where those bridges have got to be built, where those stories can be shared. And using food as sort of that common interest is probably a way for a lot of people to break the ice. A lot of farmers ask us, how do we go talk to the mob? The mob is sort of going, well, how will I go talk to the farmer? Why don't you talk about food? Why don't you talk about the opportunity that native grains and these grasses offer? It's about bringing people together on something, because for too many people, they look at the elephant and go, how are we going to eat that? Well, one bite at a time.
Sounds good. You mentioned there a minute ago, and I'm not too sure who's asked these questions, but I'll read them out because I haven't got their names on them anymore. 5% native flour mix would mean how much native grain would need to be produced? Have you any idea, just to give people a sort of a scale of the industry that might develop?
Well, I like to talk about it, maybe not 5% of just the flour mix sold in Australia, but if we got 5% of the wheat market, that's a $300 million industry. So, Yep. So that's the sort of scale we're looking at. At the end of the day, if we've got land mass, and this is an industry that's not about taking away land from wheat, it's about saying there's 5% on a property that you're probably not maximizing or using because it's too degraded. Let's start with that. Let's start returning some health back to those areas that aren't being utilized. Let's start building up the asset base. So 5% is it could be an aspirational target, and some people think it's a bit modest. I think if we can get to 5% of the wheat market, we're starting pretty well. And then beyond that, as our palates mature and we become more accustomed to a mixed grain mix in our diets from multi-country, and we got 300 different languages, 300 different countries, lots of different stories that can feed into our food. I think that 5 then can be something that we can export directly and sell bags of 100% of these native grains. But let's start with working around something that might be possible. And the other thing to this, and I think we haven't touched on it, is how do we get there? We've got an awful lot of non-farm assets that could be harvested. There's Crown lands, there's national parks, Sydney water, Melbourne water, lots of state-owned land that have got native grasses on them that we just look at. That's all food. And at the moment, we don't have farming systems for non-farm assets.
Fair enough.
Can I also add on to that?
Yep. Go, Joe.
Just like a practical image for those visual learners out there. I think 5% of the wheat market in Australia is probably about 10 million tonnes. Most of it goes export. So if you wanted 5% of that, that's what, 500,000 tonnes of wheat. I just did a rough calculation. That's that farm I showed you there, that 200 hectare paddock. We need 125 more of those and we reached our target. That's not many, really.
No, it must yield pretty well.
Well, considering you don't have to put, it's not, when you compare it to wheat, it's bugger all, but you got to factor in all the benefits. You don't have these overhead costs like, you know.
All right.
You're also grazing it too, so it's a stacked thing. But yeah, that's all we need, 125, and we get F5. 125 paddocks.
Right. Now, we've got a farming sort of question here. Could you direct drill wheat, etc., over this native grass? If these grasses are cropped and material, including nutrients, removed regularly, would fertiliser of some sort eventually be needed to replace the removed nutrients, or are harvests infrequent enough to not cause a problem?
I'll talk to the pasture cropping. I think, you know, there's plenty of experts around there around pasture cropping, and I think Cole Sice has led the way for 40 years in that space. So I think the short answer is, yeah, you know, pasture cropping's out there, it's being done, and one of the opportunities is to include native grains into that pasture cropping sort of model and harvest that grain. In terms of the nutrient load, Jacob?
Yeah, we definitely need to start thinking about how we're closing that loop, not just Australia, but everywhere. Like, our resources are finite. Things like I said, phosphorus is running out. So we do need to start thinking about how we're putting nutrients back in the soil. And this is all stuff we need. Like I said, we don't have all the answers. We need to do so much research on this. But I have this feeling like if you've got a native or a biodiverse grassland, something that's alive with particularly invertebrates, I think we're going to start getting a lot more, you know, like your calciums and that sort of thing back in the soil. It's just a hypothesis of mine, is like, I think we underrate the amount of minerals that biodiversity puts in our soil. Like, a really healthy biodiverse soil is full of invertebrates, from macro down to like micro invertebrates. So their shells are made of calcium. That's unproven. That's just a hypothesis of mine. If you have a healthy alive soil, then it's full of breaking down bodies of dead invertebrates.
All right. Now that's it.
And like the thing there, livestock in the system too.
Yeah. Now that's interesting. There's another question here sort of dealing with that, which you may have sort of answered, but there's been some recent research results that indicate Australian soils should actually be a lot more pH neutral than first thought, and they've acidified amazingly over the last 50 years. We need to put a lot of calcium into our soils to get our native grasses really kicking off. Has this been part of the equation for you? Or you?
It was sort of like that last question.
Yeah. So you still need more work on that sort of area.
Yeah, we need a team of people working on it. It's all different questions, so many questions.
Yeah. I mean, the beauty about a 5-year sort of roadmap looking at research, development, extension is saying there's an awful lot of questions that need to be asked. There's a lot of questions that need to be answered. There's a framework that needs to be built so that space of developing knowledge doesn't leak out away from it being First Nations led, because that's been something that's been, you know, occurring too much, too often, and that leakage. There's an opportunity here to how do we better share it? How do we better respect it? Because the value of bringing that story along, to be able to sell product in combination with that story, has got to be added value to everybody. I think somebody's asked a question as sort of a digress. Native grass seeds are very expensive. Yeah, So we're keen on trying to push that down. And if we start building landscape scale native grain systems, we're not talking $1,000 a kilo for Themata. We're starting to talk 20, 10, because we want to incorporate it into the landscape. It's there and it becomes part of our foodscape. So there is this sort of driving down. It's prohibitively expensive. I think as we open up these conversations and bring more land into generating more access to native grains for use in the food system, we're changing a dynamic and we're shifting away the focus on native seeds to the extractive industry, to it's the agricultural sector looking to re-establish native grains as part of their food sector.
Whilst you're on that topic,
yep,
somebody else asked the question right back at the start. Have you done any work, or is there any way of legally protecting your knowledge, intellectual property rights?
So there's a number of initiatives that IP Australia are undertaking, Jacob. So there is. I don't believe there's one silver bullet. You know, in all these sorts of systems, somebody will find a way of exploiting it. So at the end of the day, there's a system around sort of not silver bullets, but silver buckshot. And so there's IP regulations that can be employed, and IP Australia are looking at Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous cultural IP work is being done, and more Indigenous organisations are working with researchers to ensure that IP resides with First Nations people and the holders of that story. Technologies like blockchain allow that story, that knowledge to be retained with the harvest. So if it's exploited, you know, that story won't be contained in the food supply. So somebody could look to try and exploit something, but it will be showcased in the fact that it's not carrying any information. So there's opportunities there to work towards having a greater cultural license associated with these sorts of initiatives, where that authority and permissions are given, and that there's a line of sight to the people and the country and the language that are associated with that. So I think we too often look at trying to grab one instance, and I know Amanda's just put on there and reminded everybody of geographic indicators. So, you know, if we were France, you'd be talking about Champagne districts and the like. Yeah. So again, there's ways and means of adding layers of protections. We can't necessarily rely on one way, but if we have multiple sources, and even through the food safety regulations, multiple layers, multiple ways, multiple mechanisms, they offer multiple protections. Nothing's ever foolproof. There's always people out there happily to try and defraud systems, but putting enough protections allows you to have greater enforceability.
Very good. Here's an interesting question. Have these grasses been used for brewing? I imagine they might have been.
Yep, they have.
They have?
Some individuals have used them, yeah. So, you know, Black Duck Foods is not directly involved in any of that sort of alcohol story, but we know people that are. So there's opportunities there. You know, there's opportunities to using it in all sorts of different sorts of areas. There's stories about the grasses, you know, being used in different formats as well. So I think there's product development opportunities, but there's also this notion of how do we protect some of those stories. So we've heard stories that are connected to some Wiradjuri mob, and that's their story. So we wouldn't be out there advocating how it might be used. But I think there's big opportunities for people for communities who reawaken to these stories about how they can be channeled into contemporary food contexts.
No, that sounds very interesting. Now, we're at 1 o'clock, which is normally time frame. But just before we go, are these slides available for distribution? From our point of view, they are, but I mean, they're your slides.
No. Listen, I think we've recorded this session anyway, haven't we?
We have, exactly. Yeah. But you're happy to have that recording released?
Yep.
Yeah, I wouldn't put the slides out there because, like I said, part of that's in an unpublished paper.
No, that's what I'm trying to figure out. What everybody's happy with.
If we can share the video, that's fine.
Yeah, fine. Okay.
Happy to share the video.
Good story, and what we'll do is, you know, we will have a roadmap. We will have a roadmap published and available, you know, early next year. And I think that'll contain a lot more information and give people sort of part of that. But I think the opportunity here is, there's been this invitation to share some of this story, and I think having sort of an oral record of it is really important.
It's been a very interesting discussion, and I would encourage anybody that's got questions and further interested to stay in touch with you through your Black Duck organisations. So hopefully they'll do that. Maybe even sign up to be, be part of the consulting process.
We'll hang here too. I'll hang for a little while.
Right. Well, we might. That's an interesting idea. We might close the formal part of the discussions and turn off the recording, and then anybody that we'll open up the microphones, and anybody who wants to ask a question can have a bit of a discussion.
There's a couple of good points in the comment there. IP needs to be covered more accurate. Absolutely. There's in a forum like this, I think IP needs to be addressed, but it also, acknowledgement of that story and how it's done from a cultural framework. So one of the perverse outcomes when you have non-Indigenous laws, LAW, is how it impacts LORE. And I think Stephen's put a point. Themata is ubiquitous across the landscape. So how does one mob take ownership? Well, they could talk for their country, I would imagine. They talk in their language and that story for that country. So it's not Themata. It's whatever that country talks to. Themata is it's a term it's a colonial term. So each mob's going to have a different story. Wiradjuri got 40 different words for grass. That's not species. That's just the way grass works. So, there's things we've got to reimagine the way we sort of start classifying things. And when you start doing that, the way we look at a lens of IP, we've got to reimagine actually how that connects. And I think the power of story is a way of putting that into things like blockchain, because then blockchain feeds into things like Bitcoin. And if we're looking at food sovereignty and sovereignty, what about First Nations currency that's connected to story that gets traded, and it's the power of that. So I think there's a big opportunity around this to reimagine how things should operate based on 65,000 years of success of operating.
Certainly set yourself a challenge, but
you don't want to restrict people, but either
no.
Like we want everybody to grow it because it is good for country, and that's one of the big motivators for me is to heal country. That's NAIDOC theme this week is heal country. Well, here's a bloody good way of healing country.
Yeah,
I
hope it works that way. It's just that after a long history in farming and knowing how chemical companies seize onto new varieties and what they charge for them and all the rest of it, if there's a lot of money in it, I'd want it locked up pretty tight.
Yeah, well, that was a question earlier, I think, was on the native seed market is already tied up by a few companies providing mining re-veg and landscape rehabilitation, and that is definitely going to be a big factor preventing people doing this on a large scale, because if you want to cultivate 200 hectares, you need seed to do that, and it's really expensive. Like you look at cleaned kangaroo grass, it's like $2,000 a kilo. Who can afford that? It's ridiculous. So that's definitely a big thing. Is that price and availability.
Yes, I've got a section of Themata growing, so I didn't realise it was worth anything. I better go down and harvest it. Anyway, it's been great talking to you this morning, and thanks Jacob and thanks Chris, and we'll call the webinar finished at that point, and we will continue on discussing if anybody wants to ask questions. So we'll open up the microphones.
Yeah.
Thank you all.